This is Fraud, Famine, and Fascism by Douglas Tottle, Chapter 4. Cold War, Cold War One, I guess. Um, Black Deeds. The famine genocide campaign of the 1930s leaned heavily on materials, often fraudulent, traceable to right-wing anti-Soviet sources. Mainstream historians did not accept the fabrications of the extreme right. In fact, so dubious was this thesis to contemporary historians that some Ukrainian nationalists and the Cold War scholars claim that the Famine genocide has been either ignored or deliberately concealed in some form of pro-Soviet left-wing or even Jewish conspiracy. Rooted in the pro-Nazi and conservative opinion climates of the 1930s, the famine genocide issue was exhausted during the Cold War of the 1950s. The McCarthy period witnessed not only a resurgence of the lunatic right, but its alliance with the post-war wave of Ukrainian nationalists who had fled Ukraine with the retreating Germans. Um, could I get your opinion on the war? Um, yeah, I'm sorry, which war? I think there's been a long-standing history of Nazis being installed in Ukraine um, for for a long time. Basically for the purposes of encircling and taking down the USSR. Um, so Nazis found collaborators within Ukraine um, when it was under the USSR, and they with the collaboration of like Bandera, um, they succeeded in separating Ukraine from Russia, and so from that period on, every time Ukraine tried to elect someone who would actually ally and speak with Russia, open up trade again, stuff like that, the West would just coup them and take them out. Um, so yeah, there's like the color revolution in the early 2000s. I'm bad with years. I'm sorry. But then there's also the Euromaidan coup later. And now there's the propping up of Zelensky and Azov uh, via Zelensky. The McCarthy period witnessed not only a resurgence of the lunatic right, but its alliance with the post-war wave of Ukrainian nationalists who had fled Ukraine with the retreating Germans. An anti-communist marriage of convenience took place between the American ultra-right and Ukrainian nationalists, sections of whom had collaborated with the Nazis. These now required new clothes and a cover story for past activities, while the Cold War promoters could point to such people as living witnesses of the communist menace facing humanity. Red Menace. A number of books were published by Ukrainian nationalists, not only to ingratiate themselves with their new Western political allies, but also to propagate their interpretations of history among the Western public. Typical of the Cold War style of famine genocide allegations is The Black Deeds of the Kremlin. Published in 1953 and 1955, this two-volume set is yet another weapon in the nationalists' arsenal of apologetics and cover stories. Despite the admission in its preface to being motley and uneven, Black Deeds is used as a resource and reference material for the current generation of famine genocide campaigners. The publishers of the volumes, Suzero and Dobris respectively, give an indication of its blatant lack of objectivity. Suzero is the so-called Ukrainian Association of Victims of Russian Communist Terror, while Dobris stands for the equally wordy Democratic Organization of Ukrainians formerly persecuted by the Soviet regime in USA. Both groups are affiliated with the World Federation of Ukrainian and former political prisoners and victims of the Soviet regime. Of some relevance here may be the observation noted in the U.S. congressional record of the 1948 debate of the Displaced Persons Bill. No doubt, every one of them, former East European collaborators of Nazi occupation during the war, now bears a new name, passes himself off as a martyr of Soviet oppression, and answers to all the specifications of a political refugee. Included in Volume 1 is a special section devoted to nationalist allegations of Soviet mass executions during the 1930s in Vinnytsia. Unearthed in 1943 during the Nazi occupation, the graves were examined, quote-unquote, by Nazi-appointed commission, and were featured in Nazi propaganda films. Among the Black Deeds writers in this section is Petro Pavlovich, described in a photo as the chief witnesses of the mass murder at Vinnytsia. Pavlovich also testified before a U.S. congressional commission on communist aggression in 1953. However, missing from his contributions in the U.S. Cold War Commission and Black Deeds is the violent pro-Nazism, anti-Semitism, and worship of Hitler, which characterized his original account in Crimes in Vinnytsia. Written under his earlier name of Apollon Tremboyevsky, Crimes in Vinnytsia was published with Nazi authorization in 10,000 copies. An enthusiastic Nazi collaborator, Pavlovich Tremboyevsky, was editor of Vinnytsky Visti in German-occupied Vinnytsia. The preface to Crimes in Vinnytsia betrays the author's intention, and that of the propaganda exercise as a whole, to rally support for sagging Nazi war fortunes. Let the massacre strongly unite our people with the mighty strength of Germany, the liberator of Ukraine. Let it unite us in the cruel and merciless struggle with the terrible enemy of mankind, Bolshevism. The book's appeal for support for the Nazis is indicative of the degree of the nationalist collaboration, then into its third year. By 1943, the Nazis had caused the death or transport for slave labor of millions of Ukrainians. Still, the nationalists' appeals continued. Proclaiming Hitler the great humanitarian and savior, Tremboyevsky urges, only by hard work in our lives will be able to repay our debt to Hitler and defeat Judeo-communism. Crimes in Vinnytsia is riddled with anti-Semitic slurs. Tremboyevsky calls upon Ukrainians to be steeled in greater and cruel struggle against Jew communism and refers to Stalin the Jewish Emsler and Stalin and his Jewish government, and a section entitled For Jews and the NKVD. Tremboyevsky specifically blames Jews for the alleged 1930s massacres. Post-war testimony of German soldiers, however, exposes the unearthing of mass graves at Vinnytsia as Nazi propaganda deception. This is the print of that. Pro-Nazi clergy bishop Yevlohi and Archbishop Hrithri at the Vinnytsia graves opening. Bishop Yevlohi stated, The Lord God had mercy on us and sent us. Hold on, let me just. Sends for the salvation and the praiseworthy hands of the German people and their chief Adolf Hitler. Jesus Christ. Just a bunch of Nazis. We all must come to the aid of the German peoples, and with the honest work and devoted heart, hasten the victory of Bolshevism. Oh, sorry, over Bolshevism. According to Israel's authoritative Yad Vashem series studies, Oberlieutenant Erwin Bingle testified that on September 22, 1941, he witnessed the mass execution of Jews by the SS and Ukrainian militia. This included a slaughter carried out by Ukrainian auxiliaries in Vinnytsia Park, where Bingle witnessed layer upon layer of corpses buried. Returning to Vinnytsia later in the war, Bingle read of the experts brought in by the Nazis to examine the exhumed graves of, quote, Soviet execution victims in the same park. Upon personal verification, Bingle concluded that the discovery had been staged for Nazi propaganda purposes, and the number of corpses he saw corresponded to those slaughtered by Ukrainian fascists in 1941. Illustrating the Vinnytsia section of Black Deeds is a photograph of Ukrainian Orthodox Church Bishop Yevloyi. I don't know how to say this. Yevloyi. Yevloyi. Okay. Illustrating the Vinnytsia section of Black Deeds is a photograph of Ukrainian Orthodox Church Bishop Yevloyi at the opening of the graves in 1943. Following funeral rites for the victims, writes Tremboyevsky in the crimes. Crimes! It means crimes. Zyorlechin crimes. It means crimes. Crimes in Vinnytsia. Crimes in Vinnytsia. Noted. Fucking noted. Okay. Okay. Bishop Yevloyi stated, "The Lord God had mercy on us and sent to us for our salvation the praiseworthy hands of the German people and their chief Adolf Hitler. We must all come to the aid of the German people and with honest work and devoted hearts hasten the victory over Bolshevism." This is the legacy of fucking Slava Ukraini. Like, this is, I just want you to understand, it's the same thing. Overall, the editors of Volume 1 have gone to considerable pains to come up with pictorial documentation somehow relating to the book's lurid allegations. They have not succeeded, unless a cartoon of Stalin with a stereotypical facial physiognomy reminiscent of an earlier generation of anti-Semitic artists can be considered evidence. Aside from third-rate artwork, this volume is decorated with irrelevant drawings, portraits of fascist and pogromchik government leaders, the inevitable undocumented photographs, and the following indicative farce. Accompanying the article "Collective Farming" by one PV is the unusual undocumented photograph. In this case, a group of peasants with horse teams. The peasants, incidentally, all appeared well-dressed in practical work clothes. PV's powers of scientific observation enable him to state that all of them are barefoot and look wretched in their rags and tatters. The description, rags and tatters, seems better applied to nationalist levels of scholarship, since none of the peasants' feet are even visible in the photograph. In similar vein, there also appears a photo of collective farmers, a weeding team, in which some of the women are smiling and laughing. Perhaps the agency, which provided the political artwork, was fresh out of pictures showing unhappy workers toiling in ragged undergarments. Volume 1 also presents a handful of alleged 1932 to 33 famine photos plagiarized from earlier historical periods. All are undocumented. Some are stolen from 1921 to 22 Russian famine publications. For example, A Little Cannibal appears in Information number 22, published by the International Committee for Russian Relief in 1922. That this photo was stolen from its 1922 source, and not from Amende's Human Life in Russia, where it also appears, can be deduced from the following facts. Amende gives his version the caption, "Another victim of the famine" in 1922. The photo was given the caption, "Cannibal from Zaporizhia. It has eaten his sister." Jesus Christ. A parallel to the Black Deed's Little Cannibal. Other photos are taken from Nazi German publications of the 1930s. For example, the photo showing three men wearing First World War issue caps was first published in relation to 1930s claims on August 18, 1933, in the Nazi Party's official organ Völkischer Beobachter. Among those listed are generous donors towards the publication of Black Deeds is Fedorenko. Can this be the same Fedorenko, deported from the United States and later convicted as a confessed Treblinka death camp guard? Other donors include Anatol Bilach... Fuck me. Bilach Serkiewski, identified in several books as Anton Shpak, a former Ukrainian Nazi police officer, and Servka, Ukraine. Of this person, Ukrainian writer Skrybniak writes, according to the documents and witnesses' testimony, Anton Shpak and his exterminated close to 2,000 civilian residents in Bila Sverka during the Nazi occupation. Most of the victims were Jews. A surviving witness, Yevchuk, remembers, when they were leading the Jews to where they were going to shoot them, a pretty young girl ran up to Shpak. "Oh, come on, Anton, what are you doing? Don't you remember we went to school together? You used to carry my bag," she pleaded. Oh, that's a slur. Shut up, you K-slur bitch. Roared Shpak, raised his gun and shot the girl right in her face. On the same day, Yevchuk states Shpak also killed Mordko B. Diener, his wife, and an old woman, Dorja Galostupets. Beloserkiewski Shpak identifies himself as a member of the World Federation of Ukrainian former political prisoners of the Soviet regime. Had Shpak and others like him not escaped to the West, undoubtedly they would have had become Soviet prisoners, quote unquote, and stood trial for their crimes. Among Volume 1's famine writers with a Nazi collaborationist background is Alexander Haloko. This man was not only an SS member, but also worked as a propagandist for a Ukrainian SS outfit. When the Nazis invaded Ukraine, Haloko served as Minister of Propaganda for the OUN nationalist clique in Lviv, whose brief reign of fascist terror was characterized by the slaughter of thousands of Jews by Ukrainian nationalists. Subtitled The Great Famine of Ukraine in 1932 to 33, Volume 2 of Black Deeds has impeccable McCarthy-era credentials, and what is more, provides evidence of the open political collusion between Ukrainian nationalism and neo-fascist tendencies during the 1950s Cold War in the United States. The reader is informed that Volume 1 of Black Deeds was accepted as evidence by the House Committee on Communist Aggression, headed by the old Cold Warrior himself, Representative Charles H. Kirsten of Wisconsin. In return, Rep. Kirsten penned the violently anti-communist introduction to the second volume of Black Deeds. In lieu of any documentation of the illustrative material used in Volume 2, the reader is merely referred to the archives of Suzero and Dobros, as well as O. Kalienik, author of the book Communism, The Enemy of Mankind, published by the youth organizations of the OUN Bandera. Fucking Banderites every time. The illustrative materials are all too familiar. Opening the first 2 pages of the book are 9 Thomas Walker photographs and his partial accounts from the Hearst Press of 1935. The remaining photographs, none of which are documented or credited, include 10 from Mendes' Human Life in Russia, 2 of which are also used by Walker and another by Volkischer Beobachter, 1 from the 1922 Bulletin, information number 22, and a variety of Russian Civil War and 1922 Russian famine scenes. For example, the photograph captioned "The Execution of Kulaks" shows 4 soldiers and an officer, apparently on burial detail. Unfortunately for the book's editors, the soldiers appear to be wearing Tsarist army uniforms. Wrong army, wrong decade. A particularly unsavory aspect of Volume 2 is its gruesome allegations of cannibalism. In fact, Volume 2 has been called, rather unkindly, but with some justification, a Ukrainian nationalist cookbook. A series of testimonial articles bear titles like, "We ate father," "He cooked his dead mother's hand," "He ate his wife," "The children are there in the pot." Why are Nazis like this? Ew. She turned her father into jellied meat. And with a gourmet touch, pasties of human flesh. Sorry, pasties. Pasties is something else. While reading relics of the Cold War past can at times provide a rather perverse source of entertainment, Black Deeds has been used as evidence by various right-wing committees and authors, as well as to influence public opinion and policy. Though one doubts if Black Deeds was often, if ever, purchased by the general public, it has been supplied gratis to university and public libraries. This author has come across such gifts, identified with stickers reading, "With compliments from the Ukrainian Canadian Committee." Perhaps it is hoped that the unwary will be taken in. Hello! Thank you so much for the raid. I hope you had a great stream. I was actually just about to start reading to you. Literally just in time. Just in time. Perfect. Perfect timing. So you've had your brains rotten. You're rotting. And now I'm here to put the wrinkles back into your brain. Okay? We're reversing the brain smoothening. Okay? That's what we're doing in here. We rotted. Cozy. Cozy yeah, we rotted. It is the coziest place to rot. If you don't know Rhizome, they do some great coverage over there of all the worst people.
Basic facts about your hero Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm
how
a
heroic he
communist,
comes
you
across.
idiot.
But my smooth brain is comfy. It's okay. It won't hurt. It won't hurt. I promise. We're on chapter 5 of this book. For new chatters, this is called Fraud, Famine, and Fascism by Douglas Tottle. Anyway, this is about the Ukrainian famine, and how it was weaponized by the Nazi newspapers, the Hearst Press, our Nazi press, and then kind of like taken from there by various CIA outlets to promote what you probably have heard as the Holodmor. So in the first 4 chapters, they kind of went over how it's like 2 or 3 guys using fake names employed by the CIA, like quite literally employed by CIA, to spread this false narrative across, various presses. And it's genuinely a form of just like Holocaust revisionism, because like what are we talking about genuinely? We're talking about a famine which followed quite literally every country after the First World War. Everyone entered a famine period. In this period, we were in the Dust Bowl, right? Um, and equating any alleged USSR genocide with the literal Holocaust is just anti-communist propaganda. The Numbers Game, Chapter 5. The evidence presented to establish a case for deliberate genocide against Ukrainians during 1932 to 33 remains highly partisan, often deceitful, contradictory, and consequently highly suspect. The materials commonly used can almost invariably be traced to right-wing sources, anti-communist experts, quote-unquote experts, journalists or publications, as well as the highly partisan Ukrainian nationalist political organizations. An important role in... Wait, can you read this? Yes, okay. An important role in the thesis of genocide is assumed by the number of famine deaths. Obviously, it is difficult to allege genocide unless deaths are in the multi-millions. Here, the methodology of the famine genocide theorists can at best be described as eclectic, unscientific, and the results as politically manipulated guesstimates. A quote, landmark study, unquote, in the numbers game is the article The Soviet Famine of 1932 to 34 by Dana Dalrymple, published in Soviet Studies, January 1964. According to the historian Daniel Stone, Dalrymple's methodology. I am still waking up, chat. I'll get. Dalrymple's methodology consists of averaging guesses by 20 Western journalists who visited the Soviet Union at the same time, or spoke to Soviet emigres as much as 2 decades later. He averages the 20 accounts, which range from a low of 1 million deaths, New York Herald Tribune, to a high of 10 million deaths, New York World Telegram. Reproduced here is Dalrymple's list of 20 and accompanying references. This is the picture here. List of 20. This is all of the different estimates of the deaths. That's quite the range. This is quite the range. So Ralph Barnes at the low end with 1 million, 2 million, 3, 4. Yeah. Who's at the high end here? Richard Saleh. Saleh. So we've got an average of 5.5 million alleged deaths. As Professor Stone of the University of Winnipeg suggests, Dalrymple's method has no scientific validity. His quote-unquote method substitutes the art of newspaper clipping for the science of objective evidence gathering. This becomes apparent when one discovers the totally unacceptable use of fraudulent material built into the attempt to develop sensational mortality figures for the famine. And again, just to reiterate, there's a reason that there's a shared interest between our fascist newspaper, Nazi Germany fascist newspaper, and Ukrainian nationalists here. An unholy alliance. On the list, one finds, for example, Thomas Walker. Of this literary swindler, who was never in Ukraine to begin with, Dalrymple states, Thomas Walker made a comparable survey several months later, in the late spring of 1934, by breaking away from a guided tour. Walker had previously spent several years touring the USSR, and presumably could speak Russian. As unacceptable as using Walker as a source is Dalrymple's compulsion to insert groundless assumptions that this man presumably could speak Russian, not to mention the utilization of these fabrications as evidence for extending the famine into 1934. To further exploit the Walker caper, Dalrymple states that Walker included an extensive and chilling array of pictures. Yeah, and again, these pictures are often from famines in Europe, literally just European famines in general. or they're from mainland Russia, and the ones from Russia actually, like, weren't like, they're always decontextualized. Like, they'll crop out like anyone's picture. They'll show pictures from like spring, winter, and summer. Like, it, nothing is identifiable. They'll remove like landmarks, it could be literally anywhere, that kind of thing. This is just the list of where they got those numbers. Yeah, Thomas Walker in the New York Evening Journal. He's the guy we've talked about at length already. Alongside the fabrications and guesstimates of the Thomas Walkers and Langs are the politically motivated figures of Ukrainian right-wing emigres, like the nationalist Nicholas Prichodko, a collaborator who worked for Nazi-authorized Ministry of Culture and Education in Kiev during the war. Also included is the death estimate of Otto Schiller, a key Nazi functionary assigned to reorganize Ukraine's agricultural resources to meet the needs of Hitler's Reich and war machine. One notes that for Schiller's figure, Dalrymple cites a Nazi-issued book published in Berlin. Turning from one-time Nazi functionaries and wartime collaborators, one also finds the guesstimate of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Dalrymple's citation of the Archbishop's hearsay contribution seems to reflect a statistical need for clerical name-dropping. Lacking the infallibility of the Bishop of Rome, the Archbishop's claims still warrant examination. As a source, Dalrymple cites a press clipping of a debate in the British House of Lords. Canadian researcher Marco Kereniuk sheds light on the background. In July 1934, Lord Charnwood, in 1934, in July 1934, Lord Charnwood, drawing on information provided by Malcolm Muggeridge and Ewald Amende, gave notice that he would be raising a question about the famine in the House of Lords. The British Foreign Office replied, but there is no information to support Lord Charnwood's apparent suggestion that the Soviet government have pursued a policy of deliberate impoverishment of agricultural districts of the country, whether or not their policy is considered to have had that effect. In a subsequent House debate on July 25th, 1934, the Archbishop of Canterbury, doubtless also influenced by Amende's information, quote-unquote, supported Lord Charnwood by claiming a hearsay figure of 5 million deaths. Government members shut down the discussion, partly on the grounds that those who wanted to talk about famine in Ukraine were not noticeably eager to examine oppression in Germany or poverty in England. Curious that. Why don't the Nazi press ever talk about poverty in Germany or England? I wonder why. Perhaps the government members had in mind the Archbishop's remark to a meeting of the Convocation of Canterbury the previous month, in which he stated, I have the greatest sympathy with the immense, undoubted, and on the whole beneficial awakening which has come to German life in every aspect of the remarkable revolution associated with the name of Herr Hitler. Huh? A few days after the House of Lords debate, the London Daily Express began publication of the Anonymous Tourist Walker series, the initial shot in an extensive campaign on the famine in the British press. Another personage found in Dalrymple's list is William H. Chamberlain. A long-established anti-Soviet writer, Chamberlain's career eventually led him to the board of trustees of the American Committee for Liberation from Bolshevism, AMCOMLib. AMCOMLib! Oh my god, better known as Radio Liberty. Funds for AMCOMLib were raised through the efforts of Crusade for Freedom, which itself received over 90% of its income from the unvouchered accounts of the CIA. Since Chamberlain's first guess is a modest, by faminologist standards, 4 million, Dalrymple lists him twice. Chamberlain's second estimate of foreign residents in Ukraine of 7.5 million is, of course, added to the total to be averaged out. I think this is the precursor to Radio Free Europe. One also finds the death guesstimates of Eugene Lyons, whose brand of journalism landed him on the senior editor's desk at Reader's Digest. This fact is mentioned by Dalrymple's Dalrymple to presumably establish Lyon's literary credentials. Oh my god. In the minds of a less critical generation of readers. According to Dalrymple, Lyon's guess is based on hearsay, estimates made by foreigners and Russians in Moscow. Incidentally, Lyons, like Chamberlain, also served on the board of trustees of Ancom Lib. Not surprisingly, Dalrymple also lists the death figure of Ewald Amende, although Amende has not been in the Soviet Union since the 1921 to 22 period. Dalrymple notes Amende's leading post in the Aid Committee, established in the summer of 1934, as well as the establishment of various relief funds concurrently. There is little doubt that such aid committees, quote unquote, were politically motivated fronts set up for propaganda purposes. One such fund, referred to by Dalrymple, was the H.H. Elizabeth Skoropadsky Ukrainian Relief Fund, named after the daughter of Hetman Skoropadsky. Skoropadsky, it will be recalled, headed a Ukrainian nationalist puppet government set up by the German occupation authorities in Ukraine in 1918. His brief rule ended when the Germans withdrew later that year. Skoropadsky fled into exile in Germany, where he was paid a handsome pension by the Weimar and later Nazi German governments. The Hetmanites maintained groups abroad, including Canada, where they comprised a sect within the Ukrainian fascist movement. Skoropadsky was killed in 1945 during an American air raid, while attempting to flee Berlin by train. The very involvement of Hetmanite groups indicates a political raison d'etre for the relief funds, quote unquote. Furthermore, it has been acknowledged, even by right-wing historians, that whatever famine had existed had come to an end by the time these committees and funds had been established. This aspect of the farce did not go unnoticed by the media of the day. As far back as late as 1933, late August 1933, the New Republic declared, "The present harvest is undoubtedly the best in many years. Some peasants report a heavier yield of grain than any of their forefathers had known since 1834. Grain deliveries to the government are proceeding at a very satisfactory rate, and the price of bread has fallen sharply in the industrial towns in Ukraine." In view of these facts, the appeal of the Cardinal Archbishop Initzer of Vienna for assistance for Russian famine victims seems to be a political maneuver against the Soviets. In contrary to wild stories told by Ukrainian nationalist exiles about Russians eating plentifully while deliberately starving quote-unquote millions of Ukrainians to death, the New Republic notes that while bread prices in Ukraine were falling, bread prices in Moscow have risen. One wonders, in the light of claims that 25 to 50% of Ukrainians had died, just how such a bumper harvest could have been sown or harvested at all. By all credible accounts, the crops of 1933 and 34 were successful. As a tribute to this fact, very few, if any, famine genocide hustlers today support claims of a 1934 famine. However, both Amende and, following him, Dalrymple seem to have been determined to starve Ukraine to death in 1934 as well. In fact, Dalrymple's Amende source for the list of 20 is Amende's letter to the New York Times, published on July 1, 1934, under the heading "Wide Starvation in Russia Feared." In a follow-up letter the following month, Amende wrote that people were dying on the streets of Kiev. Within days, New York Times correspondent Harold Denny cabled the refutation of Amende's allegations. Datelines August 23, 1934, Denny charged, "This statement certainly has no foundation. Your correspondent in Kiev your correspondent was in Kiev for several days last July, about the time people were supposed to be dying there, and neither in the city nor in the surrounding countryside was there hunger." Several weeks later, Denny reported, "Nowhere was famine found. Nowhere even the fear of it. There is food, including bread, in the local open markets. The peasants were smiling, too, and generous with their foodstuffs. In short, there is no air of trouble or of impending trouble." Obviously, nobody had informed the peasants that they were supposed to be falling prostrate with hunger that year. But perhaps someone with the techniques typical of latter-day faminologists will suggest the presence of an armed guard crouched behind the cabbage stall, who ordered everyone to smile. Dalrymple's list also includes Frederick Birchall. Birchall? Sure. During his tenure at Berlin bureau chief for the New York Times, Birchall was one of the first U.S. journalists to jump on the pro-Hitler bandwagon and attempt to put a human face on Nazism. Yikes. American author Michael Parenti cites a CBS national radio interview with Birchall for the latter's claim that the Nazis were not intending any slaughter for their enemies or racial oppression in any vital degree. Parenti states, "While the Soviets were being portrayed as ever on edge of launching aggressive attacks on any and all, Birchall reassures listeners that the Nazis had no desire to go to war, and that Hitler could not be called a dictator. With that keen eye for the irrelevant that is the hallmark of American journalism, he observed that Hitler was a vegetarian and non-smoker, attributes supposedly indicate attributes supposedly indicative of a benign nature." And he noted that Hitler had taken upon himself the hardest job that ever a man could undertake, quote unquote. Yikes. Shout out Parenti, though. Shout out Parenti. The highest scorer among Dalrymple's 20 assembled famine genocide hunters is a Richard Saleh, whose material was carried in the Scripps Howard newspaper, the New York World Telegram. This paper's brand of journalism had the reputation of being closely akin to that of Hearst. Apparently, the Scripps Howard people felt no need to be conservative when it came to tales bashing the Ruskies. Saleh tops the guesstimates with 10 million deaths. Before departing of Dalrymple's list, let it be noted that a significant number of the sources have been shown to either be complete frauds, hearsay based on foreign residents, quote unquote, an interesting journalistic term, or hearsay altogether, former Nazis and Ukrainian collaborators, while at least 3 of these estimates are cited from the anti-Soviet campaigns of the neo-fascist Hearst, Scripps Howard style press, and another 5 from books published in the Cold War years of 1949 to 53, save one, which was printed in Nazi Germany. In establishing a background for his case, Dalrymple not only relies very heavily on press clippings, but also refers to questionable historical figures. Among his celebrities, not included in the list of 20, we find the infamous Cardinal Initzer, brought in to bolster allegations of cannibalism during the famine. Within a few years of his, quote, relief committee work, unquote, Initzer played a key role in betraying Austria to the Nazis. British historian Joseph McCabe, quoting the annual Register, states, "Hitler assured the Cardinal that he would scrupulously respect the rights of the Church. He assured the Vatican that in return for help in Austria, he would sweeten their soured relations with Germany." Initzer ordered Catholics to vote for the man who struggled against Bolshevism and for the power, honor, and unity of Germany, correspondence to the voice of the divine providence, as he said. After his own signature to the plebiscite, he added the world's Heil Hitler. Cringe. It is a matter of some significance that Cardinal Anitzer's allegation of famine genocide were widely promoted during the 1930s, not only by Hitler's chief propagandist Goebbels, but also by American fascists as well. It will be recalled that Hearst kicked off his famine campaign with a radio broadcast, based mainly on material from Cardinal Anitzer's aid committee. In Organized Anti-Semitism in America, a 1941 book exposing Nazi groups and activities in the pre-war United States, Donald Strong notes that American fascist leader Father Coughlin used Nazi propaganda material extensively. This includes Nazi charges of atrocities by Jew communists and verbatim portions of a Goebbels speech referring to Anitzer's appeal to July 1934, that millions of people were dying of hunger throughout the Soviet Union. In the hands of Dalrymple and others, the dead seemed to multiply at a most phenomenal rate. Hearsay, gossip, political testimonies, confessions of defectors, yellow journalism, Nazi and Ukrainian rightists all interconnect in an incestuous embrace throughout the famine genocide campaigns. But what about the accounts of the famine by those who did not agree with the genocide spinners' conclusions? If included, might not Dalrymple's averages be brought down to a level of demographic reality? This, though, is quantitatively unacceptable for the political purposes of Ukrainian right-wingers, Cold War academics, and Western propaganda agencies. Unfriendly witnesses must be disposed of. Since the reports of most witnesses do not support his thesis, Dalrymple must either discredit them, impute motives, or better still, not mention them at all. Thus, although Dalrymple admits that there has been some question as to the existence and magnitude of the famine, he hastily discredits those whose reports beg to differ, declaring, "Those who did not see the famine may be divided into two groups. Those who, for one reason or another, actually did not see it, and two, those who saw the famine but did not report it." Okay. Uh, Having established that he can count to two, Dalrymple has from the start laid the groundwork for the classification of unfriendly witnesses into the duped and the liars. Dalrymple then goes on to impute political and opportunistic motives to this deliberately reduced handful. The first group, one, consists of socialists who were blind to this particular fault in the Soviet program and or visiting dignitaries who were given a Potemkin-like tour of Russia, which avoided exposure to the famine. The socialists, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, for instance, saw a shortage of food but no famine as such. Dalrymple insinuates that the Webbs, like M. Herriot, the former Prime Minister of France, and Sir John Maynard, were only shown what the Russians wanted them to see. Sir John Maynard, a former high official in the Indian government, was a renowned expert on famines and relief measures. On the basis of his experience in Ukraine, he stated that the idea of 3 or 4 million dead has passed into legend. Any suggestion of a calamity comparable with the famine of 1921 to 22 is, in the opinion of the present writer, who traveled through Ukraine and the North Caucasus in June and July in 1933, unfounded. Even as conservative as a scholar, sorry, even as conservative a scholar as Warren Walsh wrote in defense of Maynard, his professional competence and personal integrity were beyond reasonable challenge. The integrity of Herriot and Maynard stand head and shoulders above anyone Dalrymple had selected to back his case. But without doubt, the faminologists can produce a Ukrainian nationalist who will testify that on the day before such visits, an official passed through the villages crying, "All whores and beggars off the streets. The Webbs are coming." Having categorized the Webbs, Herriot and Maynard, as dupes, Dalrymple claims that Walter Duranty and some other newsmen, whom he chooses not to name, knew of the famine but avoided referring to it explicitly because of government pressure. Dalrymple offers no proof of this allegation, but doubtless true to form, some hearsay or off-the-record gossip can be dredged up. The allegation of lying witnesses is a frequent theme in faminology. The Ukrainian nationalist journal Ekpa Ekran from Chicago is a in its 1983 famine commemorative issue lists, for example, Walter Durante, of the New York Times, Louise Fisher, sick. That's I think that means the same thing. Eugene Lyons, William Resnick, Morris Hindus, and others. For profit's sake, they deceived the American public and kowtowed to Moscow, while millions of Ukrainians were dying. One is shocked to discover that the well-known anti-communist Eugene Lyons on this nationalist hit list of Soviet dupes. Perhaps it is Ekpa Ekran's way of showing displeasure with his guess of 5 million deaths when the going rate is 7 to 15 million. Perhaps it's not surprising that while printing Thomas Walker's photographs, this publication charges that journalists disagreeing with this point of view were lying for financial gain without offering the slightest proof. Not content with alleging financial motives in the denunciation of unfriendly witnesses, some Ukrainian nationalist organizations and the publications resort to open anti-Semitism. A book published by the veterans of the Ukrainian insurgent army goes so far as to state, in 1933, the majority of European and American press, controlled by the Jews, were silent about the famine. The conspiracy of silence practiced by Russia and her Jewish sympathizers hides much more. In 1932, the Jewish journalist Duranty was sent from the US to check up on the rumor that there was a colossal famine in Ukraine. Duranty, later given one of the highest awards in journalism, falsely and deliberately denied the rumor. Such interpretations offered by prominent wing of the Ukrainian nationalist movement indicate a view of history closely approximating that of the Nazis. Dana Dalrymple's 1964 article was supplemented the following year by an article entitled The Soviet Famine of 1932 to 34. Some further references. Seeking to expand his earlier death guesstimates, Dalrymple introduces a report by Dr. Horsley Gaunt, who claims a death figure of 15 million. This allegation, if true, would have eliminated 60% of the Ukrainian Republic's ethnic Ukrainian population of approximately 25 million in 1932. A careful reading of Dalrymple's update, however, shows this figure to be based on what can only be termed dubious hearsay, if not fabricated rumor. Almost predictably, Dalrymple reveals the source of Gaunt's figure to be alleged conversations. Dr. Gaunt indicates that he privately got them maximal figure of 15 million from Soviet authorities. Oh yeah, a secret conversation. Of course. True to form, the alleged Soviet authorities are not named or otherwise identified. Dalrymple revealingly informs us that, while his article was not published until 1936, Dr. Gaunt indicates that he provided much of the information on the extent of the famine used by American correspondents during this period. Interestingly, Ralph Barnes, who Dalrymple mentions as an example of a reporter receiving information from Dr. Gaunt, appears to have had little faith in Gaunt's death figures. According to Dalrymple's list, Barnes' own guess was a mere 1/15 of Gaunt's claim. Such contradictions notwithstanding, Gaunt's unverifiable hearsay allegations, despite their demographically implausible figures, have contributed to the death guesstimates circulated by subsequent right-wing polemicists. Dalrymple's second section of further references features contemporary observers brought to light in a study of previously unopened records of the U.S. Department of State. This refers to a memorandum of a conversation held by Felix Cole, charge d'affaires, Riga, in a certain John Lairs with a member of a foreign legation in Moscow. Once again, Dalrymple will not or cannot identify the staff member of the foreign legation, which might very well have been that of Nazi Germany for all the reader knows. Such unfounded hearsay, based on the diplomatic gossip, hardly constitutes acceptable evidence. Yet Dalrymple has the audacity to credit 7 to 8 million people dying from starvation to such hearsay reports. Emigre reports is the third category found in further references. In apparent desperation, Dalrymple turns to the accounts of the discredited black deeds of the Kremlin. Then, after citing a nationalist autobiography published by the anti-communist Russian emigre press, Dalrymple refers to the reader to the works of fiction Wassel Barka presents a more extensive account in his novel Zotvi Kinotz, The Yellow Prince. The book describes a collective family struggle for existence during the famine and reflects the most typical occurrences of that period. Having pursued his famine fact search well into the realm of political fiction, Dalrymple notes that the novelist in question is in the employ of Radio Liberty Committee in New York, a CIA-funded propaganda and disinformation agency. In concluding, emigre reports, Dalrymple borrows a death toll of 5 to 7 million from Ukraine, a concise encyclopedia, an official nationalist apologia, whose chief editor was the former wartime head of the Nazi collaborationist Ukrainian Central Committee, Volodymyr Kubizhoyev. Dalrymple's further references totally miscarries with its final section. Khrushchev on the famine. Oh my God. Here, Dalrymple reveals the bankruptcy of his understanding without the slightest pretense of any scholarship. Shortly after my paper went to the press, Khrushchev saw fit to comment on the famine conditions during the Stalin period. Oh my God. In December 1963, he acknowledged for the first time that famine had existed under Stalin and Molotov. His comments, however, were confined to 1947. Although the quote-unquote comments referred to the conditions after the carnage and destruction of World War II, this does not prevent Dalrymple from pontificating that Khrushchev's description of 1947 hardship seem equally applicable to the famine of 1932 to 34. Such research methods, perhaps suitable for assembling a paste-up scrapbook, are inadequate for any serious purpose. However, despite the weaknesses and methodological faults of Dalrymple's study, his work has been uncritically accepted by those determined to prove a case of deliberate famine. Full page ads, complete with fake and spurious photographs, were features of the famine genocide campaign in 1983. Okay, let's get into Chapter 6, Cold War II, the 1980s campaign. It was not by accident that mass campaigns were funded across North America in 1983 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of famine genocide in Ukraine. The main purpose of the resurrection of so dubious an issue was to elevate anti-communist sentiments and facilitate Reaganite Cold War aims. Unlike earlier anniversaries, which were limited to the periphery of right-wing Ukrainian exile circles, the latest commemoration was highlighted by mass media advertising, billboards, public rallies, and continuing attempts to include the Ukrainian famine genocide in school curriculum. In Edmonton and Winnipeg, monuments to the victims of genocide were erected. Winnipeg's famine obelisk was a gift to the city from the Ukrainian Canadian Committee at a reported cost of $75,000. As Winnipeg has long been a twin city of Lviv, Ukraine, much to the annoyance of the Ukrainian nationalists, this monument can only be seen as a political provocation against the peaceful relations. It is revealing that not so much as a small plaque was ever put up honoring the millions of victims of the Nazi Holocaust. That this event took place in the 1980s stands as an unfortunate tribute to the new Cold War climate and the lobbying power of the right-wing Ukrainians. I don't know if this is the same one, but there is also the the famous like victims of communism monument in Canada somewhere that they had to erase all the names off of. Um, that's my favorite. That's my favorite. Quote unquote scholarly backing of the famine genocide campaign reached unprecedented heights in the 1980s. Credit for this was taken by Harvard University, as stated in a recent publication copyrighted by the president and fellows of Harvard College. The famine occupied only a marginal place in the historical writings produced by post-war generation of Western Sovietologists. The Famine Project, established by the Ukrainian Research Institute of Harvard University in 1981, has been most decisive in the organization of scholarly work on the famine. Members of the project include Robert Conquest, Senior Research Fellow at the Hoover Institute of Stanford University, and James E. Mace, Research Associate at the Ukrainian Research Institute and Director of the project. Harvard University has long been a center of anti-communist research, studies, and programs, often in collaboration with U.S. military and intelligence agencies. It was a Harvard history professor, William Langer, who headed the research and analysis branch of the Wartime Office of Strategic Services. American writer C. Ford has described the research and analysis branch, RNA, as the largest collection of eminent educators and scholars ever gathered together in a single government agency. RNA skimmed the cream of the social sciences departments in all the universities. Ford quotes former U.S. statesman McGeorge Bundy, who wrote The Dimensions of Diplomacy. In very large measure, the area study programs developed in American universities in the years after the war were manned, directed, or stimulated by graduates of the OSS, a remarkable institution, half cops and robbers, and half faculty meeting. What? I'm sorry, what? It is still true today, and I hope it always will be, that there is a high measure of interpenetration between universities with area programs and information gathering agencies of the government of the United States. Published in 1983 by Harvard University's Ukrainian Studies Fund to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the famine, Alexa Woropay's book, The Ninth Circle, is yet another volume in the growing famine genocide library. First published in England in 1953 by the youth wing of the Bandera faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the commemorative edition was edited and introduced by Harvard University's Dr. James E. Mace. Despite this assistance, the Ninth Circle appears to be improperly documented. Professor John Ryan, referring to a brief by Ukrainian nationalists to the Winnipeg School Board, which used the Ninth Circle as supporting evidence, charged. Their brief is a polemic devoid of any documentation, and the book, The Ninth Circle, by Alexa Woropay, is in the same category and lacks any essence of scholarship. For example, the series of accounts of personal experiences has no identification of a single person who supposedly told these stories. Other than mere scholarly shortcomings, there is a disturbing undertone to the whole book. Woropay presents a detailed account of his activities in the Ukraine during the 1930s, but he studiously avoids any mention of what he did during the Nazi occupation of Ukraine. Leaving this gap in his career as a question mark, he resumes his chronicle in 1948. But by this time, he is in Munster, Germany. Here, he is interviewing Ukrainians who, like himself, had left Ukraine. Did he and his colleagues, in the manner that thousands of others had done, leave with the retreating Nazi troops because they had collaborated with the Nazis? In his account, there is not one derogatory word about the Nazis. Instead, there is nothing but hatred and condemnation for the Soviets. With this in mind, how is the reader to view objectively view the objectivity of the material that is being presented. The Ninth Circle connection with Harvard may not be limited to Mason, the university's Ukrainian Studies Fund. One Harvard research program is particularly relevant here. Soon after the war, the U.S. State Department's Office of Policy Coordination, later a component of the CIA, commissioned a team of Harvard historians to interview East Europeans in the displaced persons camp in Europe. The research project's primary goal was intelligence gathering. These interviews provide many of the eyewitness accounts for famine genocide allegations. One wonders, in fact, if Waropay's interviews in Munster, Germany in 1948 were part of the Harvard CIA project. Waropay himself indicates that his research indicated that of little. Waropay himself indicates that his research consisted of little more than the gathering of post-war political campfire tales in a Western German displaced persons camp. As it was winter, there was nothing to do, and the evenings were long and dull. To pass the time, people told stories about their own experiences. There were many peasants from eastern Ukraine, and they recalled life under Soviet rule. Predictably, Waropay offers no political or wartime background about his anonymous witnesses, quote unquote. To have done so might well have further strained the credibility of the Ninth Circle. The pictorial proof provided by Waropay is similarly suspect. Only Thomas Walker photographs have been selected. This despite the fact that Waropay claims to have been a famine eyewitness. Can it be that he could not tell the difference between obviously doctored fakes taken over a decade earlier, including some from Russia, and scenes from an alleged Holocaust he claims to have witnessed in his own land? The text of Walker's story is not reproduced with the photos. Perhaps it is hoped that the Walker connection, like the alleged 7 to 15 million Ukrainians, will simply disappear. After all, Walker claimed to have made his travels in the spring of 1934. Waropay and Mace dare not attempt to stretch out the famine for another year. They are on shaky ground as it is. Actually, one must recall, Walker never set foot in Ukraine and entered the Russian Federation in the fall of 1934. But much to Waropay's embarrassment, no doubt, whoever snipped out the text of Walker's story missed a line under the photo opposite page 8. This line reads, "When Mr. Walker entered Russia last spring, 1934, he smuggled in a camera." If the claims of famine genocide witnesses are as fraudulent as the photographic evidence used to illustrate them, one might safely conclude that today's public is being taken for no less a ride than the readers of Hearst's famine genocide stories in 1935. This conclusion applies equally to the famine in the Soviet Ukraine 1932 to 33, a memorial exhibition prepared by Oksana Prosiak, Leonid Heretz, and James Mace. This book is the catalog of a major exhibition sponsored in 1983 by the Harvard College Library, the Ukrainian Research Institute, and the Ukrainian Studies Fund of Harvard University. The catalog's introduction indirectly emphasizes its goal of attaining an emotional impression of the famine, rather than an analysis of its causes, an emphasis which characterizes most of the famine genocide campaign. The second objective of this catalog is to convey the intangible aspects of the famine to the reader. Although scholars continue to debate the causes of the famine, the number of its victims, and its geographic extent, there can be no doubts of the magnitude of the tragedy and its spiritual and human dimensions. Through the use of photographs, memoirs, and testimony of survivors, and the literary works of eyewitnesses, we have attempted to evoke an image, however inadequate, of the nightmare world of the starving Ukraine in 1932 to 33. The nightmare evoked by the book's photographic evidence is shattered, however, by an examination of the cited sources. Harvard's Famine in the Soviet Ukraine contains 44 alleged 1932 to 33 famine photos. Almost 1/4 of these, 12, are credited to Mendes Musrusland Hungarian, the 1935 German edition of The Human Life in Russia, which contains photos allegedly taken by an anonymous Austrian photographer. Three are dubious and misdated photos, including one of soldiers in Tsarist-era uniforms from the spurious Black Deeds of the Kremlin, Volume 2. The largest group of Harvard photos is taken from two avowed Nazi propaganda books by Alfred Lappenheimer. 10 are credited to Lappenheimer's Die Sowjetunion am Grund, and 14 to Lappenheimer's Und du siehst die Sowjets richtig. In the latter, it will be recalled, Lappenheimer credits Dr. Ditlev, who subsequently found wider fame in Amende's Human Life in Russia. As we have seen, Ditlev was not above passing off 1921 to 22 Russian famine photographs as evidence of the 1932 to 33 famine in Ukraine. Three of the Ditlev photos used by Harvard were initially published in the August 1933 issue of the Nazi Party organ Völkischer Beobachter. A further 8 are among the many Ditloff photos used by the Hearst Press credited to the fraudulent Thomas Walker. Well, in themselves, famine photographs do not prove the thesis of genocide. They are used to reinforce visually charges of deliberate, planned masturbation. Verifying their origin is an issue in their own right, particularly given the conflicting claims of credit for certain widely used famine photographs. As one of the three people who prepared famine in the Soviet Ukraine, Harvard's James Mace could have perhaps clarified this issue. Previously, Mace had been associated with the publication of both The Ninth Circle, which credits Walker, and the 1984 reprint of The Human Life in Russia, which credits Ditloff for photographs shared in common. In Famine in the Soviet Ukraine, for the first time, both Ditloff and Walker are credited in one and the same book. Some care has been taken to avoid direct overlap. 8 Ditloff Walker photos are credited to Undu Seist Ditloff, and 5 different Ditloff Walker fakes are credited to Walker. One glaring contradiction, though, has been overlooked. Plate 128 of Harvard's Famine in Soviet Ukraine contains a photograph, bottom right, of a woman with a small boy, one of 5 photographs credited to Thomas Walker and Hearst New York Evening Journal. The same photo appears on page 333 of Lobenheimer's Und du siehst, where it is credited to Ditloff. They can't get their shit straight. Mason and his Harvard colleagues have had the further audacity to state in their introduction to Walker's material, American newspaperman Thomas Walker wrote plain-spoken and graphic accounts of the famine based on what they had witnessed in the Ukraine in 1933. Ignoring the fraudulent nature of the Walker series exposed over 50 years ago, the Harvard scholars conveniently backdate Walker's stated 1934 trip to 1933. This gives an indication of the true meaning of the statement in the introduction to The Famine in the Soviet Ukraine. First of all, the catalog is a survey of the present state of scholarship and current knowledge about the famine. Not only is this quote-unquote scholarship riddled with inaccuracies, exaggeration, distortion, and fraud, it resorts uncritically to Nazi sources without informing the reader of the spurious nature of these sources. Source for over half of the Harvard photos are the 2 Loppenheimer books noted previously, with over 1/3 of the books total taken from Unzu Seist. And you see the Soviets clearly, or correctly. Lobenheimer opens the section featuring the Ditloff photo collection and Ditloff's famine genocide article with these lines from Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. Literally Mein Kampf? If with the help of his Marxist creed, the Jew is victorious over the other peoples of this world, his crown will be the funeral wreath of humanity, and this planet will, as it did millions of years ago, move through the ether devoid of men. Eternal nature inexorably avenges the infringement of her commands. Okay, hold on. We've got this is just like the pictures of the print. Anti-Semitic diatribes permeate Oppenheimer's book. Jewish Bolshevism is blamed for enslaving and starving the Gentiles of the Soviet Union. The following Nazi threat against the Jews is typical. Woe, woe to the Jews and their helpers when the day of retribution comes, and it will come. And the old line of Russian blood boils up, and a subjected people shall rise up for a just purpose and free itself from this shame and dishonor. Jesus Christ. It is noteworthy that the Nazi publishers of Untitled uh ceased I don't remember German. Anyway, found the accounts of Malcolm Muggeridge sufficiently in line with their purposes to include one of his articles. Famine in the Soviet Ukraine also includes photographs from Oppenheimer's earlier book, The Soviet Union in Abgrund. The latter was advertised and endorsed by such Nazi and front organizations as the Gesamtverband Deutscher Antikommunistischer Vereinigung, fuck me, the Bund der Auslanddeutschen, and the Reichsstand der Deutschen Industrie. Widely circulated by the Nazis as anti-Soviet propaganda in the 1930s. It was also distributed through Nazi German embassies abroad. Though not selected for use in famine in Soviet Ukraine, certain photos appearing in the Soviet Union in Abgrund show signs of being altered. Given the use of anti-Semitic Nazi sources, one should perhaps not be surprised to find included in the bibliography of famine in the Soviet Ukraine a publication by former Ukrainian SS man Alexei Halovko. Halovko was minister of propaganda in the fascist OUN Bandera clique, which claimed a brief government in Lviv, Ukraine, in July 1941 under the German occupation. The most distinguishing feature of this government's tenure was the mass slaughter of thousands of Jews and anti-fascist Ukrainian intellectuals by Ukrainian nationalist Nazi auxiliaries and pogromists. Another contribution to the recent revival of the famine genocide campaign is Walter Dushnik's 50 Years Ago, The Famine Holocaust in Ukraine, subtitled Terror and Mystery as Instruments of Soviet Russian Imperialism. The cover features a white human skull superimposed on a red hammer and sickle, somewhat thematically reminiscent of an earlier generation of fascist poster art. This booklet, 56 pages of Cold War text, is often provided as a source material in attempts to get boards of education to include famine genocide in school curriculum. Published by the World Congress of Free Ukrainians, an international umbrella group uniting various nationalist factions, 50 years ago was printed by the Svoboda Printing Company of New Jersey. The latter is a descendant from the earlier Svoboda, a newspaper also published in New Jersey. Formerly linked to the pro-Nazi movement prior to America's entry into World War II, Svoboda was once banned from entry into Canada during the war as being pro-fascist and subversive. The foreword to 50 Years Ago turns out to have been prepared by none other than Dana Dalrymple. Dana strikes again, dude. This motherfucker. Perhaps hoping to distance himself somewhat from the book's crude quality and rabid anti-communist rhetoric, Dalrymple states, I'm less certain of the degree to which the famine was planned. Dalrymple still seems not to have caught on to the fraudulent nature of Hearst's old famine campaign, or perhaps he hopes his readers haven't. 20 years after his own utilization of Thomas Walker's fraudulent accounts in the pages of Soviet studies, page 9 of Dalrymple's foreword is decorated with Walker fake photographs, displaying the uncritical stance of his earlier articles, Dalrymple, in his foreword, refers to the reader to communist takeover of Ukraine from the Select Committee on Communist Aggression of 1954. Hearsay sources gleaned from the various hearings staged during the hysterics of the McCarthy era in the United States serve a far more cautious approach than Dalrymple possesses. Jushnik himself was an associate editor of Ukraine, a concise encyclopedia. Under the editorship of former Nazi collaborator Kubijovic, the encyclopedia includes rewrites of wartime nationalist collaboration and portrays Ukrainian history in sympathy with Petliura, Bandera, and Nachtigal pogromists and the Haliknya SS units. Jushnik is also identified in this book as the editor of the anti-communist journal The Ukrainian Quarterly, a fact made abundantly clear since he refers repeatedly to this journal as source material for his allegations. What 50 years ago omits to inform the reader about Jushnik's past is even more significant. According to the New Jersey-based right-wing Ukrainian weekly, Jushnik's roots can be traced to Europe's pre-war fascist movement. His obituary recalls that Dr. Dushnik was active in the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and was acquainted personally with the leading members of the OUN Supreme Council. The Ukrainian Weekly also notes that Dushnik had been a contributor to Razbudova Nazi, the Reconstruction of a Nation, published by the Ukrainian Military Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists in pre-war Europe. The text of 50 years ago is shallow Cold War rhetoric. A critique by Professor John Ryan states, 50 years ago, although ostensibly documented, violates certain canons of scholarship. For example, the book contains numerous direct quotations from Soviet leaders or directives from the Soviet government, but not in a single instance is this documented to a primary source. Instead, the footnotes refer to secondary sources, all of which appear to be anti-Soviet publications. And the most refer to the Ukrainian quarterly, which the author is the editor. This is not proper scholarship, and on this basis alone, it makes the entire publication highly suspect. If Walter Dushnik had intended this to be a serious scholarly article with a BA and an MA, he surely should have known the correct procedure. I note that his PhD is from the Ukrainian Free University in Munich, but from what I can determine, Canadian and American universities do not recognize the status of this university. For someone familiar with the subject matter, this material is totally bankrupt of any intellectual understanding of the events of that time. Rather than scholarly analysis, this material consists of a highly emotionally charged, vitriolic polemic. Indeed, it has little to do with the scholarship, and unquestionably, it is lacking in objectivity. 50 years ago continues to the nationalists' practice of using fake and undocumented photographs as evidence. Sorry, it continues the practice. Of the 14 famine photographs offered, 8 are Walker Ditloff fakes. Among the remaining 6, a pack of starving children appeared in the 1922 publication La Famine en Russie from Geneva. The collection of corpses, another standby fraud from 1921 to 22, made its 1932 to 33 famine genocide debut in the August 18, 1933 issue of the German Nazi organ Völkischer Beobachter. The graveyard scene from Amende's Human Life in Russia appears on page 36, with much of its wintry foreground cropped out in deference to Amende's dating of the summer of 1933. On page 40, the reader is offered an undocumented picture of homeless children of such outdated appearance and atrociously overcopied poor quality that its pre-1930s origin is scarcely in doubt. A naked corpse vintage 1922 decorates page 44. It too appears in the previously cited Volkischer Beobachter. Lastly, for page 46, Jushnik has selected a once handsome Ukrainian boy. This photo appears in the 1922 bulletin, information number 22, published by the International Committee for Russian Relief in Geneva. The photograph, Jushnik states, were provided by the consistory of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the USA. This church has long been the fiefdom of the former Nazi-authorized cleric and wartime collaborator Stepan Skripnik, Metropolitan Mstislav, Mstislav. Attempting to shore up his thesis of famine genocide, Dishnik turns to an examination of the number of famine deaths. Rather than averaging hearsay estimates a la Dalrymple, Jushnik's method, quote-unquote, consists of projecting an anticipated population growth rate based on the 1926 census onto the listed population of the 1939 census for Ukraine. The difference between the hypothetical estimate and the 1939 census listing is then pronounced to be famine victims. For example, Jushnik states, taking the data according to the 1926 census and January 17, 1939 census, the average increase before the collectivization, 2.36% per year. It can be calculated that Ukraine lost 7.5 million people between the two censuses. Though this quote-unquote method of calculating famine deaths is widely employed by famine genocide theorists, the frequency of its use does not make it more scientifically valid. U.S. sociologist Albert Swimansky, in criticizing an estimate of 3 million deaths, has noted, this estimate assumes A, that even in the conditions of extreme famine, instability, and virtual civil war, peasants would conceive at the same rate as in less precarious periods. 2, that abortion or infanticide, intentional or not, did not significantly increase. 3, that there were as many women of maximum productive age in 1932 to 33 as before or after. All of these assumptions are erroneous. All peasants have traditional techniques of birth control and are thus able to limit their reproduction to a significant degree. It is the economic benefit attendant upon having large families, which is operative, a factor not applicable during famine, not ignorance of birth control. Further, legal abortion was so widely practiced in this period that in 1936, the state banned it as part of the campaign to increase the population. A decline in the birth rate could thus have been expected, and not only due to the reasons outlined by Swimansky. In examining the demographics of the famine era, S.G. Wheatcroft states, as is well known, the First World War, Civil War, and the earlier years of 1920 caused a great gap in births in these years. The age cohort born in 1914 would have been 16 in 1930, and so would have been just entering the period of major reproduction. Consequently, Lorimer and other scholars have concluded that the age structure of the population would have led to a decline in births throughout the early 1930s and until the missing populations born in the 1914 to 22 age cohorts had passed on well into the future. These rather key considerations are not taken into account by famine genocide theorists such as Walter Dushnik. A similarly unscientific approach is taken by Harvard quote-unquote expert James Mace. Among Mace's many contributions to the famine genocide campaign is an article published in the journal Problems of Communism. Perhaps it is no accident that this publication is the organ of the notorious United States Information Agency, USIA. From the Voice of America to the TV show Let Poland Be Poland, from Radio Marti, beamed at Cuba, to involvement in the cover-up of the KAL 007 spy mission, The USIA is renowned as a vehicle of disinformation and psychological warfare directed against socialist countries and liberation movements. In this article, Mace states, if we subtract our estimate of the post-famine population from the pre-famine population, the difference is 7,954,000, which can be taken as an estimate of the number of Ukrainians who died before their time. Before their time. But as respected demographers, Barbara Anderson and Brian Silver have pointed out, Mace is confusing population deficits with excess mortality. By making no allowance for a decline in birth rate, Mace equates those who were never born with those who died before their time. The Mace-Jushnik methodology also ignores other factors. Change of declared nationality, intermarriage, assimilation, migration, etc., all of which have an impact on census figures. For example, Robert Wixman has pointed out that in the late 1920s, between the two censuses in question, the Cuban Cossacks were reclassified from Ukrainian to Russian. They live in Russia. Anderson and Silver note, if the reclassified Ukrainians numbered 2 to 3 million, suggested by Wixman, then between 25 to 40% of Mace's estimated deficit of Ukrainians could be accounted for in this way. There is a multitude of difficulties in interpreting this field, Anderson and Silver emphasize. They cite the noted statistician Holodmor, who wrote concerning his own findings. There are, of course, many other sources possible of error in all these computations. Consequently, these results should be accepted with many reservations. It appears that the propagators of famine genocide hold no such reservations. Not content with leaving bad enough alone, Mace goes one step further, attempting to substantiate his famine genocide assumptions by the results of the 1959 Soviet census. We can trace the famine by looking for regions where the number of rural women, the least mobile segment of the population, have an abnormally small number in age categories which would have been born immediately before or during after the famine. What? Before or during the famine? Again, Mace assumes they were born to begin with. These are Soviet Ukraine, a nation with fiercely independent traditions, regions inhabited by large Cossack populations, also fiercely independent, and the Volga German areas. But in a rather unusual oversight for a Harvard quote-unquote expert on Ukrainian history, Mace fails to take into account a significant event which occurred between the 1932 to 33 famine and the 1959 Soviet census, World War II. Mace seemingly hasn't heard that Ukraine was occupied by the Nazis from 1941 to 44 and was the scene of battles which took the lives of millions of combatants and civilians alike. Kharkiv Oblast, for example, is singled out in Mace's Geography of Death. For some reason, Mace neglects to mention that Kharkov was not only under Nazi occupation until late July 1943, but was also the regional scene of 4 massive battles prior to liberation. Of the 700,000 people living in the city at the time of its capture by the Nazis, only half survived. Similarly, Mace ignores basic facts concerning the Volga Germans. Between 650,000 and 700,000 Volga Germans were resettled eastwards during the war and never returned to the areas of their former settlement. In addition to ignoring those residents of the 1930s who died or were relocated due to the war, Mace also ignores the vast numbers who left for other areas and republics during the period of massive post-war reconstruction. In short, the 1959 census, as Mace himself knows, reveals demographic patterns primarily attributable to post-1941 developments. His attempt to detect smoke from a campfire which has been engulfed by a forest blaze is fruitless from its beginning. One might conclude that any admission of World War II was seen by Mace as detrimental to his case. He cares not about Nazi genocide, seeking only to convince readers of communist genocide, quote unquote. One gets a more graphic sense of the unscientific nature of such statistical manipulation by projecting a hypothetical famine genocide onto population trends of the province of Saskatchewan. Using base figures from the Canada Yearbook, it can be proved, quote unquote, that 228,586 residents of this province vanished during the Great Depression and the immediate aftermath. Citing such statistical proof, quote unquote, some might argue that the capitalists committed deliberate genocide against the population of Saskatchewan in the 1930s, so as to suppress the militant resistance of prairie farmers and workers, whose lives were being ruined by economic depression. Suppression of the masses' struggle, such as the RCMP attack on the Esteban strikers or the bloodshed inflicted on the unemployed trekkers in Regina? I think it's Regina. Could be cited, not to mention the mass eviction of poor tenants and farm foreclosures. Of course, no rational person would accept such a thesis. Saskatchewan, uh, Saskatchewan's lower population can be attributed to lower population growth rates during the Depression, emigration out of the province, and like Ukraine, Saskatchewan was no stranger to drought or economic upheaval. Actually, the population of Ukraine did not decline in absolute terms. Between 1926 and 1939, the population increased by 3,339,000 persons. Even given a traditionally higher birth rate for Ukraine, the rate registered, particularly in light of other considerations outlined above, hardly indicates genocide. The high mortality estimates featured in the famine genocide campaign appear wildly exaggerated from yet another point of view. 6, 8, 10, 15 million deaths, all from an ethnic population of just over 25 million Ukrainians in the Ukrainian SSR, according to the nationalists themselves, it is inconceivable that Ukraine could lose from 25 to 60% of its ethnic population and still gather a successful harvest in 1933 and then lose another 5 to 10 million people in World War II. If such inventions are followed to their final conclusions, we are asked to believe that as few as 10 million ethnic Ukrainians were left alive in the Ukrainian SSR following the war. There is little point asking how such remnant could increase to some 36.6 million ethnic Ukrainians in Soviet Ukraine alone, amid a population of 49.7 million for the Republic in 1979. Such is the folly of famine genocide numerology, fobbed off as statistics. Well, it is not possible to establish an exact number of casualties. We have seen that the guesstimates of famine genocide writers have given a new meaning to the word hyperbole. Their claims have been shown to be extreme exaggerations, fabricated to strengthen their political allegations of genocide. I'm liking this book a lot. I'm liking it a lot. We're about halfway. We're about halfway through. Next, chapter 7 is going to be Harvest of Deception.